Today, we're talking about remembering what you learned, powerful study strategies for students. So before we get started, I would love to know, what is your top concern? I'm going to put up a poll in just a moment, and it has 4 options. And you might be thinking, geez, these are my issue. But I'd love to know, what is your chief concern? What brought you here tonight? Go ahead and take a look at the poll and pick the one thing that's on your mind the most. Thank you so much. Let's see what we have coming in. Kathy, interesting. And by the way, I'm going to introduce Kathy in just a second. She's our guest today.
Tell me what you're seeing.
Yes. Okay. So battling it out so we have 4 options. Doesn't know how to take notes or study, spends a lot of time in his room or her room, but we don't know what's actually going on, procrastinates, and doesn't have a plan. Those are our 4 options. So it looks like definitely by a wide margin, the top 2 concerns are doesn't know how to study, doesn't know how to take notes or study, and spends a lot of time in his room, but we really don't know what's going on. He may not have the grades to show for the amount of time he or she is studying. All right, so that is not surprising. You know, we hear these things all the time from parents. You know, for the last 24 years, and working with students at Educational Connections, and by the way, I was a public school teacher before I started Educational Connections, and I got into tutoring because as a side hustle, I would drive to kids' homes and work with them on a one-to-one basis. And over time, I found that that was my calling in life, helping kids one-to-one. And then I eventually quit my teaching job with Fairfax County, and I started Educational Connections. And I've learned so much over the years, but what I really found to be true is that sometimes study skills come naturally, but for most kids, they don't. And these are learned skills that they can really, you know, not just learn here or there, but when they practice a lot, they can take these skills and have them not just for that moment, but for later on. And that's what we're here today to talk about. What are the skills that kids need to know now, and how can they learn these well enough to use in the future to help them, whether they're in middle school, high school, or college. And the good news is we have an expert in the house. Kathi Gould is a program manager here at Educational Connections. Oh, I just realized I did not share those results. So sorry about that. Here they are, and you can see our poll. Kathi is not only a program manager with us, meaning she talks to parents when they call our office looking for help for our kids, for their kids, but she was a Connecticut public school teacher for 27 years. She taught everything from elementary to high school. And then after she left teaching, she was actually an executive function coach for us. And she worked with kids from ages 7 all the way through adulthood. And she has a master's in education and a 6th year in educational leadership. And more practically speaking, she's the parent of a 27-year-old with ADHD. So Kathi, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me, Ann. I'm happy to be here.
So one thing that we've talked about over time is this idea that successful students study smarter, but not necessarily harder. Tell us a little bit about that.
Can we close? We still have a parent poll window up blocking the screen.
You do? I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
Melissa, do you see that?
There we go. Perfect.
Oh, good. All right, it's closed. Awesome.
You built all these pretty slides and we can't see them. So yeah, we're going to talk today. We're going to talk today about the difference between studying harder and smarter instead of harder. And I think it's interesting that the poll results were my child is up in his bedroom for hours and we don't really know what's happening. Typically we see that, and when I talk to parents, I hear that. I know they were up there for hours and hours, and then we're not seeing the results on the assessment. So what we're going to go through today is teaching kids to optimize their learning and to be more purposeful and how to study properly and effectively. Okay.
Awesome. So what does it mean knowing how to study?
So we're going to talk about, and I'm going to kind of go through this list a little quickly because we're going to get into each of these specifically. But I think when people think of studying, they only think of like the night before the test, right? Proper study skills happen weeks out. So starting 4 weeks before an assessment, 3 weeks before an assessment, the time in the classroom, the time spent at home, And it involves for the student being actively engaged in what's happening in class, asking the right questions, taking notes properly, communicating with the teacher, keeping assignments organized. Students sometimes forget that things they might have been given a month ago, they're going to need to prepare for an upcoming project or an assessment. Avoiding procrastination so they don't get into that last minute panic the night before the test. And then the last two things, spaced learning and self-testing, those are both research-based strategies that we're going to talk about later on today.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Kathy.
Sure.
So let's start out by talking about the 3 ways parents can help kids build better study habits. And help us get started in understanding the location or the space for which the child is going to work.
Sure. So we like to talk about this parent piece because, everything that happens in school needs to be, or in school or with a tutor or a coach, needs to be built on a foundation, right? And the foundation starts at home. So when parents can help to create that perfect foundation, then we can layer in the additional services or skills on top of that. So we like to say they should be in a desk and a chair. Now, kitchen counter or the stool, that's okay, as long as it's not like high dinner time and everyone else is around. But bed is not okay. We know our teenagers, the minute they get anywhere within 3 feet of their bed, suddenly the eyelids get droopy and there's not a lot of studying happening.
Yes, that's for sure. What about when they're in more of like a public place or even at their kitchen table?
Yeah, that's such a good point. So maybe they're in the, student center, maybe they're at a coffee shop, maybe they're at the kitchen counter and little brother or sister is right there. So anything, a noise canceling headphones can be really helpful for that because it takes away that sort of static that can be distracting.
Yeah, and really the ideal place, basically, I think what we're getting at is it can't be distraction free. Nothing can be distraction free, but as much as we can as parents to encourage kids to study in these spaces that have limited distractions, that's really in their best interest. What about supplies, Kathy?
Yeah, this is a big one. And I mean, when you send your child off to wherever it is that they study, whether it's up in their room at a desk or at the kitchen table, make sure they have everything they need there and not just supplies. So yes, they need their laptop, they need a writing utensil, they need a notebook maybe, but they also need whatever tools the school has provided. So a textbook or the link for the digital copy of the textbook or the planner or, that study guide. So they're not continuously getting up and going back to the backpack, going out to the car to find something, because that breaks up all the time and it ends up not being productive. So make sure they have everything they need right there with them when they sit down to begin the process of studying.
Now, one thing that's changed a lot in more recent years is that assignments are now online. So kids, they have good intentions, they always do, of focusing and getting their work done, but inevitably they go down the rabbit hole of watching YouTube videos when they should be reading their textbook online. How can parents help with this piece of digital distractions?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And this is, fairly new now. I mean, when I was in school, we didn't have any of this, right? So, I mean, I'm a parent too. And my first thing is the phone shouldn't be near the student when they're doing the studying. I know that's kind of pie in the sky, but if it's possible to do that, I would suggest that. If not, there are a number of different apps and extensions that students can use or that the parent can put on either the laptop or the phone. We show a couple here. The one I like is the one at the bottom, the teal colored. That's an app for the phone. It's called Forest. And the student is able to set the amount of time that they plan to study without stopping, without reaching for the phone, without even touching it. And if they are successful in doing that, they plant a tree and they get to grow a tree. And ultimately they get to grow a forest and they can compete with their other friends and see who has the most prolific forest or with the widest variety of plants. And ultimately they earn digital currency for that, which they can then contribute to reforesting parts of the world, which gives it a real world application and makes it kind of competitive. And it's something that kids really like to use. So it becomes a game like, how long can I sit here without touching my phone?
I love these. And the other ones are allow kids to blacklist or whitelist. Blacklist meaning that you can go into the app, like Stay Focused or Self-Control as an example. That one's for Mac. And you can say, I don't want to go to these websites. Or whitelist means I only want to go to these websites for that specific amount of time, similar to Forest. And in that way, they're able to manage their own time a little bit better. And I love that idea. So when we work with kids, we don't say, oh, you need to do this. We say, this could help you. It may not. What do you think? Is this something you might want to try? Um, so all of these things are really important for kids to be able to manage themselves. And it's a big part of what we do. You know, nobody likes to be told what to do, but if you can give kids options, and they're willing to try it and see if it works for them, that's super powerful. Similarly, you know, another powerful strategy is kind of the good old fashioned consistency and routine. Can you talk a little bit about that, Kathy?
Sure. So again, in keeping with any kind of good study habits, it's consistent, it's routine, it's predictable, it happens on a regular basis. But I think there's a bigger picture that we need to look at. It needs to be family wide if possible. And things like sleep. I talk to parents that say, oh my gosh, they stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, we know that's a recipe for disaster because then they can't get out of bed in the morning, or they do, and there's zombies. I was a teacher. I had zombies in my first period class, right? They haven't slept enough. They can't take in information if they're exhausted. Along the same lines, nutrition. I used to have so many students that would come not having eaten. They're hungry, they're distracted, they're cranky, or they ate 2 donuts and they had this sugar high and now they're bonking and their head's on the desk. And so it's just not optimal. So anytime that we can help with this, scheduling as a family. So I always think about the families that have maybe a high school student who's on a varsity sport and middle school brother is being taken along to every single game and event and activity. Middle school brother doesn't have time to do his homework because he's in the car or he's being carted around. So it's really effective for a family to sit down together. And we sort of like the idea of the Sunday night session, right? Let's put everybody's commitments on the calendar for the week and build in times for a block of time for homework. And then physical activity, it's my favorite thing to talk about. It's a big problem solver for a lot of things, but not only obviously is it good for your children physically, but physical activity boosts the brain chemicals and regulates the brain chemicals that are needed for sustained attention and focus, so that when they do study, they're able to stick with it for longer periods of time.
Thank you, Kathy. So we're here today talking about study skills. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so study skills is basically just an array of skills that involves taking in information, organizing it, retaining it in your head in some way, and then eventually being able to apply it to an assessment or a concept or some kind of a project. And we're going to talk as we go forward today about some specific strategies that can be used to help students with these kinds of skills.
That's excellent. So before we get into specific study strategies, if you find that you're at an impasse with your kids, or you want them to have these study strategies, but you're worried that maybe you're not the best person to deliver the information, we're happy to help you. We're happy to set up a call with you. It's about a 20-minute call to talk about the issues that you're having and to see if we can be a helpful resource for you. So I put our phone number here, this QR code. If you scan it with your phone, it will actually take you straight to our calendar. So Kathy or one of our other program managers can talk to you about what you're experiencing with your kids. All right, Kathy. So we laid the framework for parents. We talked about having a place for work. We talked about having as much as possible a routine for work. Let's talk a little bit about those specific strategies. And I want to start by discussing this concept of a study guide, or really the student's ability to turn a study guide into a little practice test for themselves.
Sure. So we're going to show you a couple of strategies right now. And I just want you to understand that these are just possible options that a coach or a tutor might go through with the student, but they all involve those things that we talked about of taking in the information, organizing it, retaining it, etc. So this would be an example of something that a coach could use with a student. And it could either be a study guide that's given. So picture that the teacher gave a student this 3-column paper document, right? And they have columns of what you need to know for this test, what concepts you need to understand, and what you are going to be asked to do. So that's the study guide part of it. Or a student might just have his own notes that he has taken and has this page of notes. But the next step in this is the part I love, and it's that active engagement part. So now the student goes through with a highlighter or a crayon or whatever and marks it up. So they're going to mark in green. Okay, those are the ones I know. I've got that. I don't need to spend any more time on that. The yellow, these are the ones I'm really going to need to study. So this is when we get into properly studying, right? Because students they often just keep rereading the same things over and over and over. So you could sit down, a coach could sit down with a student and say, okay, anything in yellow, this should be about 60% of your study time, right? And then the red, those are the things like, I have no idea what that is. I need to research it, or I need my teacher, I need help. Again, all of these things keep the student engaged, help them to be metacognitive about what they're doing, and also teach them about the time aspect of it. So how much time to spend on what. And the red is kind of a reminder, don't wait till the night before, because if you have those items that you do not know, your teacher's not available anymore to get the information. And then this can also be used as a self-test. So go back. So if you look at the do column, the first one on that column is, so when the student takes this assessment, he's going to be asked to fill in a map of the 13 colonies. So see if he can do it. So the student sits there, takes out a blank map. Can I actually do that? Or the next one involves putting events in a chronological order. Can I do it? Try it, test yourself. That's the best way. That back and forth is the best way to make sure that information stays in the brain.
Yeah, we know from lots of research. In fact, there are actually tons of studies on how kids learn. When we look at what are the best practices for retention, it comes down to two things. One is this concept of a self-test. Kind of, you already have a prediction. The teacher's already saying, these are the things that are important. These are the things that are going to be on the test. And actually asking yourself these questions. Basically, let me fill out a map of the 13 colonies. That's a self-test skill. So anytime you're asking your brain to work hard and pull in that information, that's something that can be super powerful in remembering what you learn. Similarly, so is distributed practice. And that's actually the second, that's the second way for kids to retain information. When we look at the studies, there are lots of ways to help your brain remember, but it really is this concept of self-test and then distributed practice.
Yeah, so let's talk about this one. So distributed practice means studying or practicing over time in smaller segments of time. So instead of sitting down for one long study session, break it up. And this ties back to what you just said, Anne, about the brain likes to be challenged. So every time, so if you study on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you are kind of exposing your brain to this 3 different times. And your brain, you have to dig back into your brain and find the schema. Where does this fit? And it makes it's like the more you walk on a similar path in the woods, the more packed down it gets, right? But this one I always equate to building a muscle. So if you want your bicep to be big and bulging, you don't just work it for 2 hours and then walk away and see results. You do it for 15 minutes on Monday, 15 minutes on Wednesday, 15 minutes on Friday, and then you see the results. And studying works the same way.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I love these concepts, teaching kids, this is the way to prime your brain and to remember. Because although they may have gotten this in school, maybe once or twice, they haven't practiced it over time. Right. And that's really key. Another thing that we do, in addition to teaching kids how to quiz themselves and how to plan out their studying, we also want to teach them how to estimate time. And this is a big thing for kids because they often overestimate how long they have to do something. And they underestimate how long it's going to take them to do that. So talk to us, Kathy, a little bit about this distributed practice map.
Sure. So this is simply taking what we just discussed, the idea of breaking studying into smaller segments over a period of days. And this also incorporates the time piece that you just mentioned, Anne. So very often we find kids, they don't know, they don't get at first how long it's going to take to do something. And so they think they can do multiple things on one night. Or they just make a list of things. Yeah, I have to do all these things. And then suddenly they say, well, I can do this tomorrow. I can do this next week. So this kind of template identifies the task, how much time it's going to take, and specifically on which day and at what time. And what I did just to make this clearer for us for our purposes today is I color coded. So if you look at the first task, the first vocabulary quiz review that's highlighted in the peach, that's the first exposure to that event. It's going to take 15 minutes. It's going to happen on Monday. And then if you let your eyes go down to the next peach block again, it's the second exposure to the vocabulary quiz review, another 15 minutes on a different day. Similarly, I did the same with the algebra. So the yellow, so that one's going to be Monday, 9 to 9:30. We're going to take a day off. And then Wednesday, 8:45 to 9:15, we're going to look at that again. But helping kids map it out like this makes it specific, makes it consistent, and they start to get in the habit of not doing it all at once. And it's much less overwhelming when they know, hey, I can get a lot of benefit out of sitting down for 15 minutes on one night and 15 minutes on another. It doesn't have to be a big, long 3-hour block of studying.
For sure, Kathy. Thank you for that. The other thing we hear on the phone from parents is about note taking, that this is an issue that their kids kind of know how to take notes, but they kind of don't. And then when it comes time for a test and they have to study their notes, they're kind of at a loss. Let's kind of move on to taking notes. What do you think is one of the most effective ways for kids to write down what they're learning in class?
Sure. So I remember when I was in school, and you might too, I remember and in fact, I'm dating myself, but we had the blackboards, right? So the teacher would write and write and write all these notes on the blackboard, and you just sat there and wrote down every single word you could possibly copy, or everything that came out of their mouths. I don't ever remember being given a template like this to sort of guide the process. So this is not new. Cornell notes are not new, but they're super effective for most subject areas. And basically, a teacher could provide this template, or a coach could provide it, but the student can also make it themselves pretty easily. And in the Q area, that's where the student might either write guiding questions that the teacher has presented, or questions the student has him or herself, or comments they have as they're taking in information. Not sure what that means. Need to ask the teacher about that one, or maybe just key terms. The biggest block in the middle of the notes, that's where the student is taking down what the teacher is saying, what they're reading in the textbook, or maybe they're watching something on a video and taking information from that. And then the bottom part is summarize it. So try to summarize, try to wrap it up, try to retell, which is like a lower level thinking skill, right? But can you kind of spit it back and then synthesize the information, which is a much higher level. If you're thinking of like a Bloom's taxonomy, right? It's a higher level of thinking. So using this tool does all of those things. It takes in the information, it organizes the information. They can use this as a study guide and go back and look at it, so it helps them retain it. And it's a real quick, easy thing to keep referencing when they're preparing for whatever the next step is.
And it really helps with that concept of self-testing, because whether it's online or, traditional paper and pencil notes, if it is the latter, they can just fold over the note part and ask themselves the questions on the left. And then when they don't know, they can, look it over, but then they can color code it. Oh, this is green. I know this. Yellow, I'm still practicing. I do not know this. It's red. Kind of bringing back your colors. And then if they don't have it with good old fashioned pencil and paper, even if they have it electronically, they can still just cover it up, and ask themselves those questions. So it kind of goes together with that self-test. And this is often what we see kids are missing, kind of to your point, Kathy, at the beginning, that kids will stay up in their room for a couple hours studying, but it's so passive. And we have to teach them, this is actually the best interactive way to learn. This is the way your brain will retain the information.
Very, very true. And this is
here's
just an
our
example. Yeah. So this is a student who used Cornell notes in a science lecture, had some questions, and noticed that her notes are notes. They're not complete sentences. I used to find this with students when I was teaching, that they felt like they had to write out complete sentences. We talked to them about, no, just words, phrases, fragments, and then sometimes even images. You can see that this student has drawn some kind of a symbol that represents a hierarchy of something. So this is another. You want to go? You want me to talk?
No, I was going to say, this is a good old fashioned one, but it's still so helpful.
Yes.
SQ3R.
Absolutely. And this one, again, taps into all those things we've been talking about, the active engagement and how do you become involved. I love this one. This activates all those things that need to happen. So the SQ3R stands for survey, question, and then read, recite, review. The survey is a skim and scan. I don't know, you're reading a history text, you need to read a whole chapter. Maybe the survey takes 5 to 7 minutes. And the student reads the chapter title, reads the subheadings, looks at charts, photographs, captions, pictures, graphs, vocabulary words, just skimming through everything, just kind of looking. It sort of primes the pump or warms up the brain. I always equate this to preheating the oven. So you're baking cookies or you want to bake a cake, and you don't put the raw cake batter into the freezing cold oven unless you want a hockey puck to come out, right? So you have to get the brain ready to take in the information. And then the second step is questions. So as they're skimming and scanning, what things are coming up for them? They might read something and say, oh, I see the word abolitionist. I don't know what that means. I'm going to write that down and get back to it later. So come up with some questions. And then the nitty gritty. Now you have to read it, right? So we're not saying you don't have to read it, but once you've done this survey, the reading becomes so much easier. And the brain actually, think of like Velcro. The brain actually kind of reaches out and grabs these little pieces based on what the student has seen in the survey and the questions they've written. And then again, that summary piece, because that gets into that higher level thinking. How do we make this make sense, pull it all together. And then in the review part is, again, self-testing. The student should then be able to go back and answer the questions that they generated initially after having read. If they can't, they need to go back to the text. I used to say this to students all the time. I would say, listen, I've been doing this for my entire life and I'm a very good, accomplished reader, but I rarely read anything one time. I almost always go back for a second read through. So that's a way to make sure that that happens.
I found that sometimes kids will read through something and they won't have a sense of what they've read. And, to you and me, when we don't understand something, we'll go back and reread it. But without coaching, a lot of kids will just keep on reading.
Right.
I had a student tell me, a 10th grader once, I said, well, what do you do when you get to the bottom of the page and you don't remember what you read? He's like, oh, I just keep on reading because I'm thinking that I'll probably figure it out as I keep on going. And that's not usually what happens. So
Right.
like to your point, priming your brain, just even that idea of, all right, I need to have a foundation for what I'm going to read. Even
Yep.
if you just do that, it's powerful. But all of these other things, like asking yourself what is important here, that review part is especially powerful as well.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to managing study time. This is a big one for our kids, especially for the kids, again, that are up in their room for 2 or 3 hours, but have little to show for it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't have a good sense of time. How do you help kids in your coaching and, the things that our other coaches do to plan their time?
Yeah, this is a big one. And I think a lot of the coaching that I do involves students with executive function deficits. So they're time blind. They don't even have a concept of what it means, how long something's going to take. And this gets into prioritizing too. If you have a lot of work, you need to figure out what can I do in a short period of time? What's going to take me longer? What needs to wait until I have a solid hour or two to dig into these things? So this is a tool that a coach could use. I love this one with kids. I also just like using the food imagery because you can always get to a teenager by talking about food. So we break this down into things that would be bites, like a single step, small task, munchers, things that are in the middle that might take 45 minutes or so. And a gobbler would be something that, okay, that's one that I need to wait until I have 2 hours on Saturday when I have to write that lab report. But so I just put in a couple of topics here that are pieces of work that students have had. That vocab quiz review, that's going to take me 8 minutes. I'm going to do that one. The essay organizer, I'm going to get that done, right before dinner. It helps them to understand how much time these things take and then to put them into the appropriate categories so it's not so overwhelming. And so there is a certain kind of rhythm and cadence to the way they work.
I remember I was once working with this college student, and this reminds me of that. And she was a really great kid, and she was actually really motivated to do a good job. But she was on academic probation, and she went back to school in the fall, and she was really, really concerned about, whether she was going to make it or not. So we started working together, and we just started talking. Tell me what your days are like. How do you plan your study time? And she said, I think I'm doing all the right things. I go to the library. Like I literally walk to the library and I and I say to myself, I'm going to study from like 2 to 5. So I give myself lots of time to study. But before I know it, at the end of 3 hours, I've hardly gotten anything done. And she didn't have a system. So she did the right things by going to a quiet place, and she had good intentions, but she couldn't get it done because inevitably, when you're feeling overwhelmed, your MO is to kind of go into avoidance mode and get distracted and do other things. Right. So I like it when, we talk to kids about time and these food terms. Everybody gets a chuckle out of it, but is this a bite? Is it a muncher? Is it a gobbler? Because then when you know how much time it's going to take you, then you can plan out accordingly. And that helps break down time a lot.
Absolutely. And this is studying smarter, not harder, right?
Yes, exactly. It's the same amount of time, sometimes even less time, but you're just using it so much more effectively. You're focused. When something's shorter, you know exactly what you're going to do. You're much more likely to get it done. So we talked about time, and I just mentioned, setting these little goals and getting stuff done. How do you encourage kids to do this?
So this is another really effective tool. I don't think this one is stressed enough. And you kind of just gave the example with your college student who said, I'm going to go and sit for 3 hours and I'm just going to study, right? With no real plan or no goal. So I like when I'm working with students, I like to set like little micro goals. So, okay, you have to learn 10 vocabulary terms for that history exam that we were looking at earlier with the study guide. So our goal is going to be that at the end of this 30-minute session, you're going to, probably know 80% of those terms, right? Make a plan. How are you going to do it? Oh, well, the teacher created this Quizlet for us, so I'm going to use the Quizlet to do that. Okay, and then get to work. When they're done, if they just do that for that 20 or 30 minutes, and when they finish and they've accomplished it, it's a real nice closure. Check it off the list, right? It boosts the confidence. They understand that, wow, if I actually set a goal and make a plan, stick to it, things happen. And they start to just internalize that and use it for every different type of task they have to approach.
And sometimes I think it takes the coach to work on this with the student. Parents can say all day long, do you have a goal?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Did you do your homework? But until kids internalize it, and it's often from somebody else outside of their family, to teach them how to do these things and to practice it over time, that's when it really pays off. So when we teach study skills, whether it's something simple like this or whether it's about estimating time, what are the specific steps that an educator, in our case, an executive function coach, meaning that's somebody who just teaches kids about study skills, or it might be a tutor who teaches some study skills along with the subject. Can you tell us about the specific steps that we go through in teaching this to kids?
Sure. And this all ties together, right? Because we're talking about, we've presented a couple of strategies that a tutor might use. So let's take, for example, the SQ3R. So when I'm working with a student and I want to provide that strategy for them and get them to learn to use it, the first step is explicit instruction. So I would do much more slowly with them than the rapid run through I did for all of you, but I would walk through that template. What does every part mean? Why is it important? How do you use it? Next step is, let's go back. Let's say we're reading that history chapter. I'm going to say to my student, okay, I'm going to show you how I would use this tool with the first 2 pages of the chapter. And then I'm going to show them as I write down my questions as they come up, skimming the chapter, looking at the pictures, looking at the charts, all those things. Then the next step is I say, okay, now you do it. So I've done the first 2 pages. Now you're going to try it. So you're going to do the next 3 pages and see how you go. So I'm there if they have questions, if they get stuck. So I've explained it. They've seen it in practice. Now they're trying it with a support system right there. And then the last step is independent practice. So then at that point, they can go off and do it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if your child has ADHD, sometimes we think that, well, they should be able to do this by now. They're in 9th grade or whatever grade it is. But it really does take this concerted effort and teaching this over time and allowing kids to do it independently and watching their success. They may not get it after the first few times.
Right.
They tend to just need more practice than other kids.
Yep.
Kathy, I'm wondering if we could switch over to Q&A because we have a lot of questions coming in.
Sure. Yeah.
And one of them is from a parent who says, what do you think about rewarding or paying your child for doing or completing assignments? Perhaps a point system to cash in for privileges and dollar amounts to purchase, to get something that they want. So earning money towards a purchase of a wanted item.
I'm all about positive reinforcement and much prefer that over negative consequences, right? Now, in your own family unit, if positive reinforcement is money, great. If it's food, if it's Netflix time, find something your child best. Find what will resonate with them and what will actually motivate them and leverage it. Absolutely. I don't see any issues with that.
I found in my own family that I did not reward with things that were monetary. I personally didn't necessarily want to go in that direction. But what I did do is say, okay, when this, like kind of using the when then approach, when this is done, then you can do that. There's actually, I'm so glad that this parent brought this up because there's actually a ton of research on this, and it shows that parents generally and teachers have good success with things that are easy to do and that are pretty straightforward, like get your homework done and then you can do this thing. Right. But it doesn't quite work when it's like, okay, get straight A's this quarter. And the reason that doesn't work is because it's too far ahead. And we've talked about that, things that require a lot of initiative and they're complicated and they're really far out. Those are really hard things for kids. And it kind of reminds me of this talk I did. This was years ago. I was at a school and it was an elementary school, and a parent came up to me at the end and she said, I don't know what I did wrong. And I said, what's going on? What's happening? And she said, so I have my daughter's in 5th grade and she's wanted to go to Disney World her whole life. And I told her that if she got straight A's this quarter, that I would take her to Disney World. And I thought she'd be super motivated. And actually she was. Like the first few days, she came home from school and she broke out the books and she was all about studying. She was super into it. But as the week went by, she was a little bit less interested. And then the following week, it was like she was back to square one. Yeah. And it's likely because that was too far away. So yes, I agree. Whatever works for your family, but in general, keeping rewards to short-term behaviors you may find better results. Kathy, Diana asked, Diane, the hard thing is that all this goes out the window when assignments take double or triple when they anticipated, or a group project turns into more work because other students don't do their part and the time kind of gets gobbled up. How do you suggest teams pivot? They may have good intentions for studying effectively, but then all of a sudden they're swamped by the amount of work. And this comes up all the time in our sessions. We go to work with a student and we're going to work on these skills, and then it kind of goes sideways because kids have this unexpected work. How did you deal with that as a tutor or as an executive function coach?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And it does tie back to time management and all of that. So I think the first thing is it doesn't happen overnight. Students will not get an understanding of how much time things take and how to, organize their very busy lives in the most efficient way with 1 or 2 sessions or just with mom telling them one time. So they need repeated exposure to that to learn how to estimate time, how to manage it. And then in terms of the group project piece, that has a couple of multiple layers to it. I would say it's probably more on the front loading end of that. So what are the expectations from the teacher in the rubric, the design of the project, deciding who's going to do which part of the project. But again, that's a planning piece, right? So if I'm working with a student who comes to me and says, we have this group project and they're supposed to be doing these slides and I'm supposed to be doing this, but they're not doing it. So then I encourage them a little bit of self-advocacy piece, go back to those people in your group or get on the shared Google Doc. You've all got access to it, and explicitly point out who is responsible. What are all the tasks, first of all, who is responsible for each task. And then there's, a group effort, like, hey, we're all in this together. We all need to do our own part so that we can come together and be successful. But that, that's difficult and that's hard, especially at, even high school level, but middle school students have a lot of trouble with that because there'll be some who just say, oh, forget it, I'll just do all of it. And then, the rest of their work gets sacrificed because they felt they had to do this. So it's more about being proactive in that kind of situation. And that's what, teachers and coaches can help with.
Yeah, for sure. Because if they can learn that skill of self-advocacy when they're younger, when they go off to college where there are more, and certainly high school where there are a lot of group projects, they have the skills to do it.
Yeah.
So Kathy, we've talked about a lot of good things. We initially started with things that parents could do, and then we talked about things that we do as tutors and as executive function coaches. But I bet a lot of parents here are thinking, what if I have a kid who doesn't want to do any of these things, who's like super resistant to studying?
Yeah, we hear this a lot. I'm sure we've all experienced this as parents, especially. So in this case, I always say, if they're really resistant, you have to get at the why. Why are they resisting? I know we sometimes think, especially with our teenagers, they're just doing it to get under our skin. It's usually not that. It's usually one of these reasons. They are overwhelmed. They don't know, just the example you just gave, there's too much coming at them. They don't know how to manage it. They don't know how to parse it out so that it's doable for them. They're underprepared. Maybe they forgot to bring the book home for 3 days and they didn't do the reading. Maybe they were sick and they missed a couple of lectures. Some students are very perfectionistic, especially students with that neurodiverse brain, right? That can be one of the attributes. They are paralyzed by fear from starting because they think if it's not perfect, it's not worth it. And then the Swiss cheese image is just skill gaps. I mean, whether it's from COVID or an illness or a vacation or a substitute teacher for 2 weeks in a row, there might be gaps in the skills. So while it's not a total panacea, knowing why is the first step in coming to a resolution, because then it helps either the parent or the coach, the tutor, change the approach. It informs the discussion and the decision about how are we going to go forward with this once you know why it's actually happening.
That's something that we can help too. Often when we see kids that, that are really resistant, we have an assessment that we give. It's based on the trans-theoretical model of the stages of change. So we understand that not every kid with every skill is going to be like, yay, mom, you signed me up for this. This is a great idea. Let's go for it. But they might be kind of resistant, like, I don't want to do this. This is stupid. But what we found is that, through this assessment, we can determine there are some things that the kid won't let us help them with. It might be that they don't want us to help them have a calendar, but they are willing to let them help them with note taking or something else. So we never go towards the thing that they don't want help with, because that's not going to earn trust. We want to earn trust and help them with the thing that they're willing to get help with.
Absolutely. And that point about the assessment is so important, because when we see where the student is on that continuum, that changes the approach. So you're right. You're not, it's banging your head against a wall if you've got a child who's on the very left end, like not even quite thinking that they need help yet. If you're going right for, you need to use a planner, you need to use a calendar, that's counterproductive. So again, it gets back to, why are these things happening? Talk to me. Tell me what this is about. Tell me what your fear. And, over time, you get to the root of the problem.
And then I just want to mention, Kathy, to your last point about Swiss cheese kids. We call them Swiss cheese kids because, kind of like Swiss cheese, they have these holes in their learning. And they go to class and they look like they're paying attention. But in reality, they're kind of in and out of focus. They tend to be the daydreamers. So they go home to do their work and they have some skills, but not the other, because again, they have these holes in their learning. So they're not quite sure how to do it. And then when that happens, they start to avoid or put in minimal effort. We see this a lot in kids, and especially since COVID, I would say that there's a lot of reasons kids are resistant, but this is one of the top reasons. And we also see that it tends to happen more in cumulative subjects where one skill builds upon another, like math, right? Like math. And especially if you were, during COVID, you were taking a really important class, like maybe you were in 4th grade and you were learning fractions, decimals, and percents. Really, that's the foundation even for algebra. Or maybe you were in pre-algebra and algebra. When you have gaps, it's really hard to fill those in on your own. And it could be another cumulative subject like a math-based science in high school or a foreign language. And when kids have difficulty in those subjects, study skills will help, but it is not the answer. They often need a tutor to help them, or they need to be going after school to see their teacher on a regular basis to get those gaps filled in.
Yeah.
The other thing is to know when support is needed as a parent. You might be feeling that maybe it is study-based. Maybe these are the issues your child's having is due to study habits, but maybe it is that they're Swiss cheese and the areas they're having difficulty in seem to be these cumulative subjects. So, really being diligent about understanding where your child is, having conversations with them, and figuring out, could a little bit of help be needed? And if you do need a little extra support, we're here to help. This is what we do. And we're happy to have a call with you. And as I mentioned, we have a number of program managers that work with kids, Kathy included, that can have that conversation with you to see what's going on and to see if we can be helpful. And you can take a look at our schedule and schedule a calendar appointment just by scanning that QR code. All right, so I would love to go over to Q&A now. And I know if you have a question, please throw it there in a chat. I know that we have some questions waiting for us. So Kathy, let's go to Q&A and I'm going to read these out and let's talk about them. All right,
Sure.
so Diana says, do you know of any apps that integrate with Google, the student calendar, where all the assignments and extracurriculars are posted that could be used to create study plans to better cope with the workload? I have not personally had that experience that something like that is out there. Kathy, what have you seen on your end?
I'm trying to think, I mean, certainly they can sync the, if they're using Google Classroom, they can sync that to the Google Calendar that they can pull up on their own computer every day. So all the assignments show up there. And when they use, and any of them do it, Schoology does it, Canvas does it, but they can do a week view where every single assignment is there, or they can do a whole month view. It's also color coded. So like I would work with students and they knew, oh, anything in green, that's history. So it's really visual and easy to pick. You can also, once you've done something, it gets a strike through. So you know, okay, that one's taken care of. And another tool that works with Google is in the email, there's like a to-do or a task list on the side. So sometimes they'll get an email from a teacher, something is due, etc. They can move that with a click over to the to-do. So it creates a to-do list just based on those emails. So you know how us, sometimes you're going through, I don't know, several hundred email a day and it gets lost. That sort of singles it out and pulls it over, and that can upload to the calendar as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. I wasn't even thinking about just seeing everything in the calendar like that. One other thing that kids have found to be successful is using Google Keep, which can also integrate, and it's kind of like a post-it note system electronically. And kids that are super visual, as you mentioned, Kathy, also like Google Keep. All right, so another question from Nicole. Your child is motivated by time on devices. If they are already getting this, it turns into a consequence, but saying once you finish XYZ, you can have time on your device. Does that make sense? How do you use time on devices to help manage homework? So Nicole, you're right. Like if the student is already getting it, you can't then use it as a reward. So you wouldn't say if they already come home from school and they're on their iPad, you wouldn't really be able to use that for a reward, but you could change it a little bit and withhold it and say, when you finish this, then you get that. It's a little bit harder once they've already had it. So I might see if there's something else that they might be interested in. It could even be that, you know, you have time for all your kids. So not just the child that you're worried about, but you could have a blanket policy in your house that for 15 minutes after school, kids just go outside, and then that they can have those other things. So it might not really be a privilege so much, but you're still getting them to do something else for a short period of time before then. But it's hard when they've already had these things. But I would say, you know, look for shorter, smaller wins. I haven't had great success with parents saying, you know, I'm taking your phone away for the week. That tends to create a lot of resentment in kids. Yeah. And so usually there's a better way. Like, yes, you can have your phone, you know, do this first for 15 minutes. Something like that might work out better. All right. So Francine said, sometimes kids are resistant due to thinking what they will do is good enough without having to study. How do you build on that motivation? I've seen this in a lot of kids, Kathy. I'm wondering if you have too, where kids are kind of happy with good enough. Like they haven't put much effort into it and they might get a B or a C, but they don't really have a pain point. Have you seen that?
I haven't. I think that's the pain point is sort of a good one to focus on. So I usually work with kids then on goals, and it's always a conversation. It's never, I'm telling you what to do, or for any coach or tutor, they're not telling. It's, well, talk to me about, you know, do you think you might have plans to go to college? Or do you think you'd like to continue to participate in the varsity sport that you're on? Well, if you continue to get C's, the coach might call you up and tell you that you're not eligible to play, right? So I like to take it sort of outside the initial academic piece and sort of push it out larger. What's your greater goal? How important is that to you? So sort of like an urgency, you know, how it really is that a priority? Once you have that conversation and they say, well, yeah, it's really important to me. Okay, then what are the steps that we need to take to make that happen? And in that, then you can sort of distill it down to, well, I guess I need to spend an extra half hour studying that so that I get the B+ instead of the C, so that I can apply to the colleges, et cetera. It's kind of a cascade effect, but putting it in their court so they get to tell you what their goals are. And then you can sort of on the back end, figure out how to help them leverage that to get what they want.
I found that to be really effective too, Kathy, because a lot of the kids we work with are kind of like now or not now kids. So they see what's like right in front of them that hour or that day, but anything that's like 2 weeks out or, you know, like a year out, it's just in another world. And so having them talk to us about what their plans are for the future and helping them to see the not now part, it can be really powerful to them.
Yeah. And I've even worked with kids and said, like, on one day, I'll say, you know, what's it like when you come home and you haven't done this assignment? What happens tonight? Oh my gosh, my mother is crazy and she's raising her voice and it's not fun and they don't let me watch TV and all that. And I say, oh, wow, wouldn't it just be worth it to get mom off your back? Like, you know, we get down on their level and they say, yes, you're right. Let's do it. Let's get it over with. So even those, and that's a super short-term goal, right? Just to make your evening better. So when you start with the little pieces, then you can build to bigger ones.
I love that example, Kathy. Okay, so I want to go back to the Google Calendar question. And Diane says, yes, I understand that it's all there in the calendar, but how does the student break down that down into smaller tasks? I think this is what I was mentioning. I don't know of an app that does that. We do that with kids every day. So an executive function coach is somebody who helps kids look at what they have to do that day and set priorities, but also what they have coming up later that week or the following week, and then take those bigger things like a test, a project, an essay, and break them down into smaller components. Kind of to the point Kathy mentioned earlier that, you know, when you study, is it better to study an hour on Thursday night for a test on Friday, or is it better to, you know, do 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, and 20 minutes Thursday? Well, we know from research that it's better for long-term retention to do a little bit each night. And so when it comes to the Google Calendar, we have those discussions with kids and we have them physically put the task into their calendar.
Yeah.
We've also found that, you know, when in the past, we used to create to-do lists with kids, like, okay, today you have to do all these things. It just doesn't go nearly as well as when kids put those things into their calendar. Because now they know, okay, I've scheduled this for 20 minutes. This is exactly what I'm going to do. I know when I'm going to do it and how long I'm going to do it. And that's better for students than having a to-do list. So it does, if the child can't do that, Diane, if you're seeing that your child can't do that, it may take somebody else to help them learn how to break it down. All right, Kathy, Cindy says her seventh grader is getting lower grades than he should, and it's taking him a long time to do the homework because he uses a school-provided laptop during the day and at home to surf game websites. The school laptop doesn't allow for extra controls. He doesn't have internal self-discipline to stop, and he apologizes after the fact, but I can see how he is gaming at school on his school computer. He won't start his homework or stay on the homework site unless I look over his shoulder. He has no cell phone, no weekday screen time privileges, and the promise of earning extra screen time after homework has not helped. Do you have any advice?
This might be one of those situations where one of our earlier slides with the sort of the white list or the black list kind of thing that, you know, mom or dad can reach out to the school. The IT department can do that for you and say, can you please block these sites for us? Or also getting to that, again, I know she said that like extra screen time isn't a motivator for him, but what would be a motivator? Is there something else? And that whole idea again of, I always like to say, if they ask something, like my own kids, if they say, well, can't I so-and-so? I always say yes, if. So yes, you can do that if a certain condition is met. So kind of trying to work it that way. So you're not automatically saying absolutely not, which shuts the kid down, right? So yeah, sure, you can use that site later, but if you do XYZ first. And, you know, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to know all the answers to this. The whole digital piece, it is tricky. It's hard. And especially though, we find that if you have a student who has ADHD and it's really hard for them to pay attention, really hard for them to focus, their brain actually gets that dopamine hit from constant clicking and seeing several different sites. So that's part of the brain wiring. So that's not, you know, that's something that again, an executive function coach can really help with that, because they teach them how to perseverate longer on something and not to be so kind of, distracted by things that are going on around them. But it's a very real thing.
It is real. And I've seen that in a lot of students too. And what I've often recommended is to, it can't be for a long period of time, like having the expectation that now your child is not going to, go to video game sites for 2 hours when he's doing it all the time may not be realistic. So it could be that he agrees to set a timer for 15 minutes. Sometimes with kids, we start out with the tolerable 10. And it's the idea that anybody can tolerate anything for 10 minutes. And so maybe you have a discussion. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me about this. What would be a happy medium? Would 10 minutes work? And even that might be a start, that 10 minutes or even 15 minutes. But what we also know from research is that the brain, when you're working alone, can sustain attention for about, before that wanes, for about 25 minutes. And this is called the Pomodoro method. And the Pomodoro method, it's actually based on research from the 80s, showed that when people set a timer for 25 minutes and not more, and they have a specific task, kind of to your point, Kathy, I'm going to do X. It's super specific. It's not like I'm going to study, but I'm going to go over these Quizlet note cards. And then I'm going to quiz myself using Quizlet. That's an example for 25 minutes. That primes your brain to know I'm going to do this specific thing, and it's not going to be more than this time. So when kids are just getting started, it might be a shorter time, like 15 or 10 minutes. But as they get better, it can be maybe that 25-minute time, but perhaps something more than that. They need a break before they try again. Okay. Shaba says, I have a college kid who is on academic leave because of procrastination and playing on the computer and not studying. He has no motivation. Thoughts on that, Kathy? Or do you want me to take that one?
You start and I'll jump in.
Okay. So this is huge. And we know that, the number one reason kids don't do well in college or end up leaving college is financial. But behind that is that they have a hard time managing their time. And it's for good reason, because when they're in high school, everything is ultra structured for them. They go to class from 7:30, 8:30, then they switch classes and they go to another class. But in college, they have these broad swaths of time in between class. So what I would recommend is getting a coach for your son while he's in college, because he's shown that he can't do this on his own without outside help. And there's no amount of, telling kids to study more or focus more, or don't be so lazy, all those things, try your best. None of those things work when we give, we say these broad statements to kids. So I would recommend having somebody who specializes in this. We're happy to help you, help him. But if you don't want to do that, then sitting down and having a conversation at a scheduled time, kind of like an appointment, and asking, what do you think could be helpful? Was there a day that you had good luck trying something? What was that like? What did you do? Did you go somewhere else? So asking those powerful questions, not did you do this? Did you do that? That doesn't work. But asking a student, have they been successful in the past, even for like an hour? What was that like? Would you be willing to try that again? Could trying it in a different way work for you? Because sometimes it is a little bit of detective work initially for kids.
I think that's so true, Anne. And I think when this particular parent mentioned motivation, and we hear that a lot. But I think, again, it's important it might not necessarily be motivation. It might be one of those other issues, overwhelmed, underprepared, skill gaps, et cetera, right? So that conversation that you're talking about gets at those kind of pain points for that particular student, and might really help them to, it's not that they're not motivated. They're so overwhelmed with not even knowing how to start that they just don't want to do anything.
That is so true, Kathy. I hear you. We see that in kids a lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I know we've gone over by a minute, and I always try to end on time. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. If I didn't get to your question, feel free to email me. I'll shoot you back a quick response. My email is Ann, ANN, @ectutoring.com. So on behalf of Kathy and myself, we really Appreciate you being here. Hope that you got some good skills and wish you all the very best for the remainder of the school year. And don't forget to fill out that survey when it pops up right after I end the session. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.